The newsroom smelled like burnt coffee and electricity the night everything tilted. I remember the fluorescent lights humming like someone clearing their throat, the clack of typewriters shutting down, and the peculiar hush that arrives when people know they're waiting for trouble to announce itself. I had been on the city desk for 3 years, 28 and stubborn, convinced the world could be pried open with enough questions and patience. That conviction felt like armor until the first call came, a terse tip about a break-in at the Watergate complex. My editor's voice over the wire was a small thing, tight and oddly amused, but it pushed me into my coat and onto the street before I had swallowed my coffee. I arrived before dawn to the clotted blue of Washington's sky, to police lights blinking against the geometric glass of the Watergate, to a knot of low men in coats whose faces looked like they smelled old cigarettes and strategy. They led us near the lobby only after the first flurries of facts had been confirmed. Burglars, cameras, the Democratic National Committee's headquarters. The guard, brittle, exhausted, kept saying the same thing, like a prayer. He'd found tape on the doors, tape to hold them open, and had called it in. Later, I would learn his name, Frank Wills, and his shrug when asked how he noticed the tape would become small legend. But tonight, he was simply the man who had turned a routine walkthrough into the first stone thrown at a mountain. Nobody recognized yet. We wrote what we could that morning. The arrests, the broken lock, the fact that someone had been inside digging for listening devices. The chain of custody was still a rumor when the Post's front page started reshaping the city. Words like burglary and committee for re-election slipped into conversations like teeth. I was there for the small things. The clerk who found the tape in the broom closet. The janitor with a cigarette still glowing in his calloused hand. The intern who'd been at a desk and heard footsteps. A wash of ordinary details that made it impossible to write the whole story, as if it were only a set-piece burglary. I filed pieces that day. I watched more seasoned reporters lean their chins in, smell the angles, speak in low conspiratorial cadences. It was the first of those days I understood how a scandal begins, not with a shout, but with small, stubborn noises that won't be made to go away. I started to follow threads in ways I had no right to, researching committee names, following lists of campaign expenses that read like someone's private ledger. I told myself I was learning, that curiosity equaled duty. The truth was more mundane. I wanted to be present at the moment history decided it would be easier to lie than explain itself. It became quickly clear the burglars were not aimless thieves. They carried gear, they had targets. Rumors started, snippets overheard in hallways. A half-remembered name whispered between. Reporters who had read more briefs than I had. People like Woodward and Bernstein began to appear as if conjured. Older, scarred by scoops, their presence a steadying force. Watching them work was like watching two surgeons operate, hands precise, questions probing. They had a way of making sources feel like they were giving a confession they meant to deny. I shadowed them when I could, feeling equal parts awe and a burgeoning hunger that a good reporter recognizes as both gift and poison. There were nights I lay awake on my couch, thinking about the faces behind the committee names. Imagining motives is a dangerous indulgence, and yet the city breathed its own motives into me. A desire for power that smelled of orange peel cologne and cheap bourbon. A fear of being outmaneuvered that made grown men act like children. My own life felt trivial beside it. An apartment with a leak in the sink. A mother in Ohio who wanted me to marry well and stop taking trains to anonymous meetings. But the scandal pressed a blistering need onto that triviality, turned it into a lens. The newsroom became an altar, and we were the acolytes, whispering into tape recorders. I fell for a source in that scrape of hours. Not love in the tidy way movies make it, but an electrical current between a well-placed whisper and the person who could make it live on the page. That relationship would test lines I didn't know I had. No one in the newsroom gave you permission to keep a secret, but sometimes secrets are the only way you can reach another human being inside a story. First microhook. A man in a suit slipped me an unmarked envelope at midnight. When I opened it, the paper inside had only 2 words. The 2 words in the envelope, "Follow the money," landed like a cold coin on my palm. It was both instruction and dare. For days afterward, that phrase became my map. I began to dig through public filings, to cross-reference donors with contractors, to find the thread of small checks leading to men who spoke in lists and acronyms. One late afternoon, a clerk in the Federal Records Office, an older woman with a voice like gravel, slid a file across to me and said, "Be careful. People who play at this don't always like losing." I didn't tell her I wasn't merely playing. I was already past the point of deciding. The game had me. The deeper I went, the more the story smelled of a machine, someone's design made of envelopes and telephone calls, and men who thought themselves invisible because they wrote their sins down in ledger books instead of shouting them aloud. Second microhook. A name in those ledgers matched a man I'd seen at the Watergate that first morning. Weeks turned into months, and the weeks held hearings that felt as public as a child's punishment, but far more consequential. The names multiplied: counsels, aides, executives. And each hearing was a theater of small confessions. I test drove courage in those rooms. I learned to listen for the lie in, the comfortable laugh, the tell in the practiced pause. People began to speak like they were trimming the fat from a story they wanted to keep. Sometimes, in the quiet of my apartment, after hearings, I would replay testimony in my head, putting snippets like puzzle pieces together, even crafting entire motivations for men who, on paper, looked like decent citizens. The nation watched along with us, television blinking, watchers at home trying to reshuffle the meaning of words like cover-up. I learned that scandal has its own cadence, a rhythm of denial, then deflection, then the slow, inexorable collapse as truths accumulate and someone finally admits the arithmetic of evidence. Third microhook. In a late-night phone call, a voice I barely recognized said, "There's a tape. He ordered it recorded." At the center of it all sat a presidency increasingly anxious, its spokesman trained to smile as if the teeth were enough to distract. Rumors spread about tapes, about missing minutes, about White House counsel whispering in corridors. I remember thinking that if what I suspected were true, then we were not merely watching a crime. We were watching the undoing of a covenant, the promise between the people and those in charge. I began to sleep in the newsroom more often, curled under a stack of rolled press releases like a shipwreck survivor under flotsam. My friends' questions became softer, their faces like coastal towns, watching a storm move inland. My mother called less. The source of the tape rumor was a meeting in a parking garage with a man who smelled faintly of aftershave and vinyl. Someone who gave me directions to a library box with a roll of audio tape inside. He insisted he was giving me something for my protection as much as for the public. "If anything happens to me, Claire, you'll have to tell the country what you know." I tucked the tape into my bag like contraband and walked home with my heart beating like a fist against my ribs. Fourth microhook. I played the tape once in the newsroom, and my boss walked in halfway through, saw the player, and did not speak. There are moments a reporter keeps for reasons other than their news value. A laugh shared over stale donuts, a hand on a shoulder at 3 a.m, a stolen cigarette behind a courthouse. Those moments anchor you, remind you you're human when the scandal tries to make you into an instrument. But they also complicate things. The man with the aftershave, my anonymous source, began to ask me to shield him, to avoid naming him in copy, to keep his life separate from the story he fed me. I thought I could be both compass and shelter. I thought wrong. The harder I protected him, the more I felt the story tighten around me like a fist. Loyalties in this business have a way of straightening your spine into uncomfortable shapes. You find yourself curating the truth as if it were a museum piece, afraid the public will not be kind to the broken things on display. Gimai Tui, editor, once told me, "You can be kind, Claire, but make sure the kindness doesn't bend the facts." He was right in the way editors always are, right when they want the world to be simpler than it is. Fifth microhook. A reporter across the city published an account that contradicted a detail my source had given me. It set off a chain I couldn't predict. By then, the story had become more than headlines. It was a test of what the country tolerated from its leaders. We were young enough to still believe in the sanctity of institutions and old enough to see them wobble and, in some cases, crumble. I had days when I imagined walking into the Oval Office and shouting truths, but that was fantasy. In practice, we sat in hearing rooms and peppered witnesses with questions until their answers frayed, until someone finally said something that couldn't be mended with spin. The work was surgical and terrible and thrilling. The tapes, the ledgers, the nights of following men home, all of it accumulated into an evidence pile that threatened to burn down reputations, careers, and possibly a presidency itself. I learned to hold the weight of that possibility like an animal in my hands, prickly, alive, and dangerous if handled with anything but respect. That first chunk of time, the break-in, and the months that followed, felt like the opening of a book whose spine would never glue back together. I found myself writing lines that, months later, would look prescient, about the arrogance of men who assumed their secrets were proprietary, about the brittle way institutions tried to patch holes rather than step into light. I wasn't naive. I knew the world had always been made of compromises. What I didn't know then, what none of us could have known, was how personal truth would become. The scandal demanded confessions of men and of institutions, sure, but it also demanded that those of us who covered it examine the seams of our own motives. Why were we telling this story? For public good, for career, for the thrill? The answer was messy, an admixture of all three, and it would complicate every relationship I had for years to come. I remember the day the tapes came down like thunder. Not some cinematic reveal, but a slow, bureaucratic unspooling that felt worse because it was so ordinary. The revelation happened in rooms where men spoke in depositions and in a judge's chambers where paper moved like the sea. Evidence arrived on spools and on pages and in the flat, legal language of subpoenas that suddenly held the smell of betrayal. The tape I'd carried in my bag, the one my source placed into my hands with that plea, "If anything happens to me, Claire, tell the country," sat in the bottom drawer of my desk like a sleeping thing, humming with potential heat. I had held it as both weapon and promise. By the time the president's lawyers argued that tapes were personal property, and by the time reporters lined the corridors to stand and listen to 1,000-word explanations from men who suddenly preferred silence to clarity, I knew that the measure of our work was not the scoop itself, but what we did with it when the world turned toward us. The nation watched. We watched back. Microhook. That night, someone banged on my door and left a folded photograph that made my hands go cold. The photograph was of my source, taken from a distance outside a diner, a cigarette in his hand. On the back, in a hurried scrawl, someone had written, "He's being watched. Don't go after him alone." For a moment, I felt the cheap, private panic people feel when they discover an unlocked window at home. Then the newsroom did what it always did, turned the panic into plans. I put the tape in a safe deposit box. I told my editor everything I had. He did not scold me for the months I'd kept parts of the story private out of misplaced loyalty. He listened with the wooden face of someone who has held better men on tighter ropes and knows when to let them climb and when to cut the line. He called a meeting with the two people I'd been watching for months, Woodward and Bernstein. Their names now as familiar in the newsroom as the hum of the coffee machine. They had a cadence to their questions that matched mine, and something about working together in that small circle made our job feel both less like theft and more like duty. Microhook. A late-night call from the Department of Justice whispered a name I wasn't supposed to know. The investigations became a machine with teeth. Congressional committees took to television like actors stepping into a scene they'd rehearsed in private. Witnesses testified under oath and then tried to explain themselves in press rooms, their words slippery as oil on stone. I sat through hearings with my hands folded, thinking of the janitors and clerks whose lives had been touched by a burglary that started as a petty act and metastasized into something that unsettled the whole country. I thought about Frank Wills and the way his ordinary vigilance had widened into extraordinary consequence. I thought about the strangers who handed me documents under diner tables, who trusted that my recorder would be kinder than the men who'd betrayed their offices. The story asked of me choices that were not only professional: whom to protect, when to publish, how to weigh one life against the public's right to know. I had learned that the most dangerous part of reporting is not the lie you uncover, but the one you tell yourself to justify keeping a secret. Microhook. A typed memo arrived in the wrong mailbox, and inside, it was the name of a White House aide I'd begun to suspect. The tapes, when they were finally authenticated and made part of the public record, did what evidence often does. They made the whole thing harder and the truth clearer at the same time. In the recordings, there were pauses, the sound of a man clearing his throat, the faint clink of glass. There were also decisions, recorded before they became public, instructions given in late-night rooms about covering things and handling leaks. For those who had spent months whispering to one another in phone booths and alleyways, the tapes were like a light thrown into a dark room, showing not only the hidden men, but the scaffolding of the lies. I sat in a small conference room with my colleagues, and we listened, and each pause on the tape felt like a fresh bruise to the nation. My source's voice was not on the tapes. He had given me evidence that corroborated other work, not the recordings themselves. But because of the documents he'd provided, because of his insistence that someone must speak if anything happened to him, other voices lined up to reveal their truths. The dominoes moved. Microhook, a junior member in the administration, someone who'd been barely visible, suddenly requested immunity, and his testimony named people I had never expected to hear mentioned. Testimony peeled back the veneer of policy speak until you saw the raw anatomy beneath: greed, fear, vanity. Men who had once believed themselves untouchable found themselves reading statements that made them sound small. The president's voice, when it came, was the thing that changed the arc for many of us who had sat on those tapes like coals. His public statements tried to soothe and to obfuscate at once. They sought to reframe the scandal as a series of small and excusable errors. But the evidence grew. Papers and ledgers tied campaign financing to a pattern of illicit payments, and auditors and accountants whispered about diversion and deception until the numbers themselves became witnesses. It was a peculiar thing to watch a public life unravel, because you knew so intimately that unraveling began with private acts. We, as reporters, had the terrible privilege of watching the seams come apart, and the responsibility not to tear them wider than they already were. Microhook. My editor handed me a sealed envelope containing a note from a woman who said she'd lost a husband to the scandal's ripple effects. That note became a small, human anchor in the ocean of politics. It was from a woman named Ellen, whose husband had been a mid-level staffer forced into early retirement when allegations swirled around his office. She wrote about the nights her husband had spent staring at the ceiling, about the unemployment checks, and the way pride withers slow as winter. She was not asking for vengeance. She wanted the truth, clean and ugly. I visited her once. We sat at her kitchen table, and she told me stories about a man who had been kinder than his career had shown. She made the scandal feel like a living thing that ate households, not just headlines. I thought about Ellen at odd times over the next months. When I read testimonies that mentioned men like her husband, when I watched the Senate floors where men in suits argued as if reputations were ledgers to be balanced rather than lives to be tended. The work was not a parade of metaphors. It was a ledger of small human losses. That knowledge kept me honest when others suggested narratives that favored spectacle over clarity. It made me return to documents and to witnesses with more patience than I might otherwise have had. Microhook. One quiet morning, my source called me and said, "They know I talked." When he said it, the world narrowed to the telephone line. I remember the silence at the other end when I asked who. His voice, always careful, was a rasp of gravel and fear. He told me about surveillance, new patterns in the diner where he ate, about the car that sat for days across from his building, about a man he'd seen in a suit at the end of the block who smiled like someone who felt he'd been triumphant. He said he was going to disappear for a while, to let the dust settle, but he wanted me to promise that if anything happened to him, I would tell everything I had between us. We had a strange pact, made of mutual terror and a very human belief that truth mattered more than our safety. I promised. Later, in the testimony rooms and in the long investigations, I would watch as invisible things became visible in ways I could never have predicted. But in that telephone call, there was an intimacy that felt like the first brittle leaf of winter. Beautiful, inevitable, and slightly horrifying. I wrapped my coat around myself and waited. Then I went back to the office and wrote until my fingers ached. The crescendo began not with a single dramatic moment, but with a quieter, cumulative pressure. Public opinion shifted as hearings aired on television, and pages of testimony were printed. Friends and strangers called the newsroom to ask if what they heard on the radio could possibly be true. The president's political maneuvers grew more frantic. Aides and counsel wrestled with how to respond. We wrestled with when to publish what we had, knowing that the rush for the next story could both illuminate and obscure. My own fear became professional. Would our reporting be used as a cudgel, or would it be an instrument for clarity? The question haunted me at odd hours, like a cough that would not go away. Then, one afternoon, when the Senate moved toward a recommendation that would change everything, the president did something I did not expect. He announced, in a voice that sounded like someone reading from a script written for them, that he would step down. The announcement sat in the air like a long exhale. I sat at my desk, the newsroom around me a hive of quiet motion, and I felt both relief and an odd, aching sorrow. A country's moral compass had been banged and battered, and while the outcome felt righteous to many, there lingered the cost. The careers disrupted, the dignity shattered, the small human stories like Ellen's husband left in the wake. After the resignation, the hearings did not immediately stop. There were legal reckonings and reassessments, and some men paid the price in ways that made headlines, while others slithered into new forms of influence. I watched as lawyers and judges tried to put into words what the tapes had made visible. A culture of entitlement, of secrecy, and of corruption that had crept from top to bottom. We continued to publish because history is not a single event, but the slow, patient work of keeping facts alive. My source reappeared months later, gaunter and more careful, and we met in a parking garage where the light was cold and unkind. He would not let me write about him as anything but a footnote. He said that what mattered was the outcome, not the story of his own small bravery. He asked me not to blur his edges with drama or to make his sacrifice a myth. I promised him what I could, truth, and only that. When I walked away from that garage, I felt the odd relief of someone who has given blood and felt it clot. The aftermath of the scandal marked me in ways I did not immediately register. People asked me to speak on panels, to write reflections, to tell the tale of the sources and the nights and the tapes. I said what I could, careful, blunt, and honest, because I had learned that theater and spectacle were easy to produce, but moral clarity was a different craft. Relationships frayed and reconfigured. My mother called more often, her voice threaded with a pride she did not know how to translate into conversation. Ellen and I kept in touch. Her husband found work again, slowly, like a plant pushing through concrete. My anonymous source faded from my daily thoughts into occasional shadows. Sometimes I saw his silhouette in the reflection of a window and felt the old, sharp gratitude. The newsroom changed, too. Names rotated, careers ascended and fell, and the work kept its relentless rhythm. A new story arrived every morning and demanded to be told. In quieter moments, I thought about the bargain we'd all struck with the public. Reporters, citizens, officials, alike. We had, for a while, been the ones entrusted to keep the covenant between truth and power. That covenant is messy and imperfect. It demands sacrifice and it asks the impossible of ordinary people. Yet the country had chosen to respond, not merely with outrage, but with legal and civic remedy. People went to the polls with a new wariness. Institutions took small steps toward transparency. None of it was perfect, and much remained to be done. But those of us who had been in the thick of it learned a lesson both bitter and clarifying. That no democracy thrives on secrecy, and that truth, when it comes slowly and clumsily through human hands, still has the power to change the arc of a nation. Years later, when I teach young reporters in a cramped university classroom, I tell them the story in the parts that matter. The patience of paperwork, the ethics of protecting a source without becoming their accomplice, the way witnesses' quiet grief can anchor a narrative. They ask about glory and danger, and I answer with a kind of weary candor. I tell them to be brave in the way that means courage without recklessness, to remember the names of the janitors and clerks and mothers who are the true currency of any story. Sometimes they want to know about the man with the aftershave, and I tell them what I can, that he was flawed, brave in his fear, and that he chose to help because he thought it was right. They press for more, hungry for myth, but I refuse. The story was not a myth, it was a ledger of human choices, and that ledger remains open for anyone willing to do the work. On the anniversary of the break-in, I visit the Watergate building. Tourists mill around, taking photographs, their faces lit by small devices that flatten the world into thumbnails. The glass looks the same, but the city feels older and perhaps wiser. I think about the nights spent under fluorescent lights, and the envelopes, and the tape, and the sound of recorded pauses. I think about the people who trusted me, and about the ones whose lives were rearranged by a scandal that began with a clumsy burglary and grew into an examination of the country's soul. Walking past the lobby, I see a security guard checking doors, and I remember Frank Wills, and I feel both the ache of history and the small comfort of things that do not change, human dignity, and the stubborn need to ask questions. In the end, what I carried away from that time was not a sense of triumph, but an understanding of responsibility. We did not save the Republic single-handedly. We were instruments and witnesses, and we did our work as best we could. The resignation was a punctuation mark, not a cure. The work of tending democracy goes on, tedious, mundane, necessary. I still keep a small tape box in my desk, not sentimental, but as a reminder. Evidence lives in objects as much as it lives in memory, and sometimes the smallest items, like a piece of tape or a recorded pause, can change the course of a life. When I close my office drawer at night, I tell myself what my editor told me long ago. Be kind, but do not let kindness bend the facts. And in that balance between compassion and clarity, I'll keep living my life and doing this work, because if there is anything I learned from those long years, it is that truth matters, and sometimes telling it is the only way to keep the covenant alive.